He would sit in silence, perhaps sipping coffee in a crowded cafe, unnoticed, yet watching everything. His power wouldn't come from titles or followers or applause. It would be found in the way others reacted around him, in their nervous glances, in their over-explanations, in the way they changed their tone when he entered a room. He'd be a ghost in the machine, a presence that didn't need confirmation because it was felt, always. If he gave you advice, you'd find yourself following it instinctively. If he said nothing, you'd obsess over what he might be thinking. That's the level of influence he'd command, not through pressure, but through psychological weight. People around him would find themselves performing for his silence. He wouldn't need to expose weaknesses. They'd do it on their own, eager to be acknowledged, desperate for his approval, or terrified of his indifference. He would master the art of silence so well that it would become a form of interrogation, a mirror that made others speak their fears aloud. He wouldn't threaten your position. He'd simply make it clear that he was watching, understanding, calculating. And in that space, you'd spiral, wondering how much he really knows and when he might act on it. He'd build relationships like trapdoors, warm and inviting on the surface, but once you stepped through, you'd realize there was no way out. Every gesture would carry double meaning. A compliment would feel like a warning. A silence would sound like a verdict. He wouldn't shout commands. He'd whisper suggestions that became actions in other people's mouths. If he lifted you, you'd rise so high you'd forget he was the one who placed you there. And if he let go, you'd fall without knowing who cut the rope. That was his genius, making others believe it was always their choice. He'd play chess on a human scale, not by moving pawns, but by turning people into their own pawns. Give them the illusion of autonomy, the sweet taste of self-direction, then nudge them slightly and watch their trajectory realign. He wouldn't fight wars. He'd provoke them, then appear as the only sane solution. He wouldn't need to win arguments. He'd change the questions entirely until people forgot why they were even fighting. He would turn insecurity into a map, using people's hidden doubts as guides to their loyalty. Tell someone they're brave for showing up, and they'll cling to you for seeing the effort no one else did. Compliment their silence, and they'll share secrets to prove you wrong. That's how he'd draw people in, not by being magnetic, but by becoming the only mirror they trust, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Because once someone feels seen in their flaws, they become addicted to that clarity. And in the moments when he chose to disappear, he'd haunt the spaces he left behind. Decisions would be made in his imagined presence. People would wonder how he would have reacted. Meetings would feel empty without his silence. His legacy would outlive his participation. That's how he'd engineer control, not in how loudly he ruled, but in how completely others internalized his absence. You wouldn't know his allies. They wouldn't wear badges. They'd seem neutral, ordinary, until the moment they weren't. And by then, you'd be isolated, wondering how you lost grip on the room. He wouldn't lead through speeches or plans. He'd change behavior just by being in the orbit of those in power. He'd convince you that his idea was yours, that your decision was spontaneous, that your loyalty was earned when in truth, it was planted, watered, grown, and when people betrayed you on his behalf, he'd never say thank you. That's the final proof of control. When loyalty requires no acknowledgement. When people move on your behalf, not because they fear you, but because they fear losing the version of themselves that you created. He'd weaponize your need for him and then make his exit seem accidental. That's when you'd realize he wasn't just helping you win. He was ensuring you couldn't win without him. Even his flaws would be strategic. A sudden loss of temper, a deliberate misstep, an offhand comment. These weren't mistakes. They were breadcrumbs, left to humanize the myth just enough to keep people close. You don't follow perfect people. You study them, admire them, but you don't trust them. But someone who slips once, who bleeds just a little, now that person feels real. And realness is addictive. So he'd show you a crack just once, then seal it shut. Leave you wondering if it was ever real. And that wondering, that's loyalty disguised as curiosity. His enemies wouldn't know they were enemies until it was too late. His friends wouldn't realize how entangled they were until leaving felt like self-destruction. He wouldn't campaign for power. He'd position himself so that power arrived at his feet, confused as to how it got there. You wouldn't see him pulling strings. You'd feel your actions being guided, redirected subtly without resistance, like gravity. He would never ask for recognition. That's what makes his influence permanent. He'd let others take credit, hold the spotlight, receive the applause, because the one who gets credit also gets the target. But the one behind the scenes, he's the constant, the unmovable piece on the board. While others compete for attention, he'd own the silence between their moves. And from that silence, he'd rewrite the script. If he offered you advice, it wouldn't be urgent. It would come slow, measured, like rain before a storm. You wouldn't even realize its importance until weeks later, when the situation unraveled exactly as he predicted. And then you'd remember his words. And then you'd realize who really had control, not the one reacting, but the one who never had to. His stories would circulate without him. Parables whispered in boardrooms, lessons passed between rivals who once stood on his side and now serve as cautionary tales. He wouldn't be famous. He'd be referenced, not with awe, with reverence, with hesitation, as someone you mention only when you're sure no one's listening. Because just saying his name might shift the balance of power again. He would build from within, always. Never impose. Instead, he'd infect structures with his way of thinking until they didn't know where his influence ended and their own decisions began. That's the mark of a true architect, not someone who leaves fingerprints, but someone who leaves blueprints behind. His ideology would thread through systems, decisions, conversations, and by the time you noticed, you'd be too deep to undo it. That's legacy. Not what people remember, but what they unknowingly repeat. He wouldn't aim to be feared by all. That's a novice's desire. He'd aim to be feared by the right few. Those in power. Those who understand the stakes. Those who see how close he is to everything they hold dear. The rest? He'd let them laugh, let them ignore, let them dismiss, because that's the perfect cover. While they're distracted, he's designing the next 10 moves. And when they finally realized what he was doing, they'd be too entangled to act. That's the difference between threat and inevitability. Threats can be confronted, but inevitabilities, they're just accepted. That's how he'd move, as a force, as a wave. And once you recognized it, you were already in it. He wouldn't protect power like treasure. He'd treat it like a current, something that must flow through others to remain vital. That's why he'd build others up, shape them, guide them, even if they didn't know it. He wouldn't just lead. He'd create leaders molded in his image. And when people interacted with them, they'd think, he reminds me of someone. That's how he'd echo, through minds he never even met. And when someone tried to replace him, they wouldn't find a seat to fill. They'd find a void, a system too complex to imitate, a rhythm too precise to mimic. Because he didn't just influence moments, he built operating systems, invisible ones, that others lived inside without question. And when he left, they wouldn't know what was missing, only that something vital was gone. His name wouldn't trend. That's not how he'd measure impact. He'd measure it by the pause in conversations when he was mentioned, the shift in tone, the glances exchanged. You wouldn't see him, but you'd feel the change the moment his name entered the room. That's real power, not being talked about, but being felt in silence. He wouldn't celebrate victories publicly. Every win would be a private checkmark. Every success, a quiet step forward. Because the moment you seek applause, you start performing. And performance weakens intention. He wouldn't perform, he'd execute, with clarity, with precision, with a mind so calm it unnerved everyone who expected chaos. And if someone ever truly tried to study him, to understand how he thought, why he acted, where he was going, they'd find echoes, patterns maybe, but no roadmap, because he wouldn't operate from logic alone. He'd operate from rhythm, from timing, from intuition sharpened by thousands of silent observations. You can't teach that. You can't bottle it. You can only feel it when it's near. When he needed something, he wouldn't ask. He'd design circumstances so that others offered it. That's the highest form of influence, to create desire without request. He wouldn't demand allegiance. He'd create conditions where it seemed inevitable, and by the time someone tried to resist, they'd already sacrificed too much to walk away clean. He would not manipulate emotions with volatility. He'd do it with balance. He'd be the calmest person in every storm. And in that calmness, others would collapse, revealing everything. Because most people aren't ready for silence. They fill it with words, confessions, doubts, and he'd collect everyone like a record, not for use, for leverage. Leverage that doesn't age, only matures. Even when he forgave, he wouldn't forget. Not out of bitterness, out of precision. Because every past betrayal would inform a future move. He'd remember, always. Not with rage, but with calculation. The past wouldn't control him, but it would shape the game. And he'd play it better than anyone else, because he understood the rules he never said out loud. He would turn even absence into a tactic. Let them miss him. Let them wonder. Let them realize too late what they lost. And in that space, he'd expand. In their memory, in their routines, in their plans, he'd become a factor they couldn't remove, a silent advisor they couldn't unhear, not because he stayed, but because he left perfectly. He wouldn't speak of revenge. That would give it shape. Instead, he'd move forward so swiftly, so effectively, that those who wronged him would be left behind, still processing a battle he already won by evolving beyond it. That's the final form of power. Not retaliation, but transcendence. And finally, he wouldn't be remembered for what he said. He'd be remembered for what he made people feel. A shift in posture, a reconsideration of motives, a new fear, a new clarity. His legacy wouldn't be a statue or a slogan. It would be a change in atmosphere, a code embedded into the psyche of everyone who crossed paths with him. He would not chase power. He would become the reason power moved, and long after his name faded, his blueprint would remain, etched into the minds, systems, and silences he mastered, because that is how true psychological domination lasts, not in moments, but in memory, not in fame, but in forever. Even in his final acts, he wouldn't declare an ending. He'd leave without closure, without a grand exit, without a bow. Because real power doesn't end, it dissolves into other forms. You'd find his influence in someone else's tone, someone else's timing, someone else's silence. His principles would live on not as teachings, but as reflexes. People would move like him, speak like him, hesitate like him, without knowing where they learned it. That's not a legacy. That's a virus. And he'd have written himself into the operating system of behavior. He wouldn't seek to be remembered as a man. He'd want to be remembered as a presence. Not a voice, but a weight. A feeling that something important was happening, even when no one could explain why. They'd tell stories, sure, but never quite the same way. Because no one would know the whole truth. Each person would have a piece, a moment, a conversation, a silence that changed something inside them. And when they tried to put it into words, they'd pause, Because how do you explain a force? You don't. You just feel it? And that's where he'd live. Not in history books, in instincts. The decision not to speak when others yell. The urge to watch when others rush in. The precision to move only when it matters. That's where he'd remain. Quietly, unshakably, timeless.